Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Mahara Allbrett, whom I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So Allbrett is a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which is from the region around what's now Vancouver. And a lot of her poetry deals with sort of self-fashioning, right? The creation of identity, which is, of course, fundamental to what we as human beings do. And some of the things that sort of shape the self-fashioning of Allbrett's poet personas are native identity, interpersonal relationships, connections with nature, these sorts of things. She's also really, really good at imagery. So there's a lot of very specific, detailed, concrete imagery that works quite well in the poems. So the first one that I'm going to read you is called Indian, and I-N is on one line, D-I-A-N is on the second line, all lowercase. And this one definitely is about self-fashioning in the context of an indigenous identity. So this is Indian. "We are North Americans," he said, and made me feel ashamed that I was not wearing beads at my throat, small proud flowers growing there or leather. Serene stump, handsome-faced, color of earth rose quietly, telling me that I am Indian now, and ending all the identity fears, the spiritual smell of burning sweet grass I smoke from the pipe my brother passed to me. I pass it to my sister, it goes around. So what I find really cool and fascinating about this one is the sort of competing elements through which this indigenous identity is affirmed or asserted or sort of spontaneously generated internally by the speaker of the poem, right? So this idea that at the beginning, "We are North Americans," he said, and made me feel ashamed that I was not wearing beads at my throat, small proud flowers growing there or leather. It's an interesting opening, right? Because what it suggests is this is a speaker who's fundamentally sort of uncertain of their identity, that this speaker has a specific conception of what it means to be Native American or First Nations. And in some senses, that's a very interesting element because it, on the one hand, does reflect genuine cultural elements of many cultures in North America. Beads, flowers, leather, these are very traditional materials for decoration, for construction of clothing among traditional indigenous North American groups in many cases. And yet they are also these sort of symbols of indigenous identity as constructed by a Western worldview, right? So this sort of sense of like, I read and reviewed a book recently, Bethany Hughes's book Red Face, and one of the things that she talks about extensively in that is how indigenous identities were constructed through the repetition of signs in a dominant Western aesthetic spaces, theater in particular, but also art, poetry, etc., right? So as these particular things became symbols of indigeneity, dominant white culture increasingly sort of imposed that cultural coding onto indigenous people, right? So this idea of, if I'm not dressed like a stage Indian, then I'm not sort of properly performing my traditional culture is an incredibly fraught notion, but it's partially fraught because it's not entirely without foundation, right? Like, moccasins became a symbol of indigeneity in the white colonialist imaginary, but they were also a traditional footwear worn by indigenous peoples. And so these things have this sort of fraught history, and sort of issue that this raises is the question of, especially in contemporary contexts with the sort of rise of indigenous resurgence in the period really since the 1970s, right? This sort of sense of a desire to return to indigenous culture, indigenous values, indigenous political and socioeconomic structures, etc., etc. The question becomes, what does that mean apart from the ways in which settler colonialism and capitalism has imposed an ideology on not just indigenous people, but on settler colonial people in general, right? So that sort of sense of, I feel like I am not sufficiently being indigenous, is a really interesting opening bit. And then we get this sort of external validation. Sarain Stump, who I've done a video about his poetry before, sort of affirming this. And then we have this bit, and ending all the identity fears. The spiritual smell of burning sweetgrass I smoke from the pipe my brother passed to me. I pass it to my sister, it goes around. So that's really fascinating, right? That there's this external authority, Sarain Stump, who says, you are properly indigenous. But then we move from that external authority to this performance of a very traditional ritual among many indigenous groups, and the communal nature of that, right? This sort of equitable nature that is really characteristic of many indigenous cultures, that it is not, I smoke from my pipe, it is, I smoke from our pipe, and then it goes around. It creates community. It binds us together through this ritual, right? So I think that's really, really interesting. Another thing that we see in Allbrett's poems is construction of identification with nature, or the construction of a speaker's identity through analogy with nature. And again, this is a very central element of many indigenous North American cultures, very strong ties to the landscape or particular landscapes or spaces, and to natural elements, right? So many indigenous cultures don't recognize necessarily a division between the human world and the natural world in the way that we, those of us coming out of Western cultures, traditionally sort of feel very strongly, right? We don't, as human beings from a Western tradition, feel like we are on the same level or part of the same creation or whatever it is as other living beings, whether that's fauna or especially flora, right? Whereas many indigenous cultures have a much stronger identification between the human, the animal, the plant, the spiritual, right? These things are all interconnected, and they are on the same ethical level of responsibility. So we see this, for instance, this sort of navigation of identity elements and the natural world in a poem like The Mountains Are Real. The mountains are real, they are me. I slept beside these mountains, near this water, long before I was born, in the cocoon of my mother's womb. Lain by this river, once I envisioned a large bearded head floating in the water, half filling the inlet. I could see it from the golden arc of the bridge, the lions, Sometimes I stand for long spaces of time, looking at the mountains and the sunny water in the distance, at the land, at the clouds, or I lie on my back, looking up at the immense blueness, enjoying the sky. The earth is soft and curved under your body, and I remember what he said. When all your friends are gone, you still have this, the mountains, the oceans, and yourself. Someday soon, before you leave, we will go far away to a cabin in the trees and enjoy silence. So again, there's this great movement of the construction of the speaker's identity along parallel lines to the existence of this natural world, right? This sort of idea, I slept beside these mountains near this water long before I was born, right? The idea that like I as an individual exist only in the context of the world as such, right? That it is about that fundamentally we are interconnected in these really, really important ways. And that interconnection defines who individuals are, right? Like we can't be without the world in which we exist. And so fundamentally there is not a division there, right? There's so much of this sort of blending, this obscuring of what seems to us from the Western tradition like borders, boundaries, right? Between the self and the other, between the self and the natural world, between different places, right? The mountains and the ocean are presented as on equal footing in terms of the identity formation of this poet persona, etc. So we've got all of these sort of linked elements here that I think is really, really cool. The way that Allbrett navigates these issues of identity and how we come to be who we are only through the contexts in which we exist. So I'm going to read you one more poem out of this collection. And this one is more of an interpersonal one, but it's about sort of loss and memory and the ways in which our relationships with others form who we are. So this is an elegiac poem, an elegy, called Linda Louise. Linda, I miss your sunny coral lipstick, fruit-flavored scents, older adolescents teaching me to dance, to summer music, crisp ironed shirts, white ruffled tops, everything the latest. The lion sleeps tonight will always remind me of you. You were the coolest. White Shoulder's perfume always reminds me of you. I dedicate my life work to you. There is nothing that can measure the shock I felt that morning to learn of your death. I was 15, you were 19. Our brother, drunk, drove through a red light. 28 years later, and I cry as I open a tube of coral lipstick in the drugstore, understanding now, why I've been craving that color around me. When I was a child, you ran after me and cradled my head to your breast when I was afraid. I'll never forget your beautiful brown eyes. I'll never forget your joking and teasing. I'll never forget. So again, this is an elegy. It is a poem of loss, a poem of memorial for a lost person. And one of the things that I find really cool about it, one of the things I really like is, again, this sort of interpersonal connection, the deep ways in which Linda Louise has shaped the worldview and the psychology and the understanding of the poet persona, right? So it's not just, I miss you. It's, I miss the impact that you had on me. You were formative for me, and I miss that connection, right? I miss that link between the two of us that gave me so much meaning. I think that's really, really cool.